Ебать, это четвертая нахуй! Пятая, блядь!
Since the NATO and Washington are losing the war in Ukraine, is there a risk that they will move the front to Finland, Sweden and the Baltics?
I'm not sure at all, actually. I think it's... but there is definitely preparation for some kind of Arctic war, that they have been thinking in these terms. But if they will use it now, immediately, I'm not so sure. But, I don't know, really. You could try.
No, well, I don't think they would open Scandinavia as a front in this war. The Georgian Prime Minister is currently expressing concern that they're looking for regime change there, the Americans that is, in order to open a second front against the Russians. But in Scandinavia, I don't think so, but I agree with Ola, because already back in 2019 you had people like Mike Pompeo going to the Arctic Council arguing that it should be more geopolitical. We have to confront the Russians in the Arctic, and since then you've seen more and more military presence by the Americans. Now they're opening bases across Scandinavia, and I think they will become much more assertive in Scandinavia. So I think our region, which used to be a region of stability and peace during the Cold War, will have more of a frontline status in the years to come. But I don't see a hot war opening up at this point now.
What one could say possibly is that the maritime strategy from the 1980s, that most likely is still part of US thinking, is that in case of a conflict somewhere else in the world, one should try to attack the Kola Peninsula, or the strategic submarines in the far north. That was the idea in the 1980s. But I doubt that it will happen now immediately, because it's very, very risky. And people say that Soviet Union was much stronger compared to Russia today and so on. But it's not really true. Russia is quite strong when it comes to missiles and hypersonic missiles with very precise targeting. And it's the nuclear side. Russia is certainly not weaker than the Americans. So it is, and of course Russia do not have the same amount of ground forces as Soviet Union had, but nor have the West.
Later, after the Swedish government finally signed the DCA agreement in June, NewsVoice returned to Diesen and Tunander and asked whether they still believed Sweden could be used as a deployment area for a greater war against Russia.
In the 1980s, Americans complained about Norwegian security policy restrictions. The construction of weapons of depots and pre-storage of military equipment in Trøndelag in central Norway and not in the north was perceived as idiotic, but the Norwegians did not want to become a target for Soviet preemptive strikes, which easily would have been the problem if this pre-storage had been located in the north. But in mid-1990s, I remembered an US attaché from the embassy who said that it may not have been such a bad idea after all, because you could quite easily transport material from Trøndelag through Sweden to the Baltic States. Sweden could be used as a transport link in the same way as we know from a previous war. Sweden was also an unsinkable aircraft carrier where the Baltic Sea served as a protection, and for obvious reasons, the most senior US military attaché in Sweden was, at least during the Cold War, an air officer, while the most senior attaché in Norway was and is a naval officer. Under President Reagan, the US Navy pushed for the maritime strategy, which ultimately involved horizontal or geographical escalation in the event of a war on the Central Front, in other words, to hit the Soviets, where they were as most vulnerable. To escalate vertically into a tactical nuclear war was seen as possibly catastrophic, partly because it would be a terribly devastation in Europe, and partly because no one knows whether such a war could escalate to a strategic nuclear war, which also included the United States. The idea of the maritime strategy was that in the very first minutes of a war, the US Navy should begin to sink Soviet strategic submarines with their intercontinental ballistic missiles, which constituted the Soviet Union's second strike capability. The Navy should also try to knock out the Kola bases, which were of enormous strategic importance to Moscow. If the US Navy succeeded in this, the United States could take out the land-based Soviet missiles, and that knowledge would in turn force Moscow to retreat, the Americans claimed. No one knows if it would work, but it was very risky in any case. The problem is that the same thinking is almost certainly relevant also today. The Kola bases and strategic submarines are vulnerable and of vital importance to Moscow. They can be taken out by the use of very silent attack submarines, but also with aircraft and missiles from Scandinavian territory, which in turn can open up for a Russian missile attack to preempt the American attack. In the event of a stalemate in Ukraine, or perhaps rather in the event that Ukrainian and Western forces are losing the war in Ukraine, Western countries such as the United States or Great Britain could seek to identify vulnerable points for the Russians that, at the same time, are of great strategic importance. That is, they would very likely focus on the high north, and with the DCA agreement between the United States and the Nordic countries, this problem will increase radically. As I wrote in my article on Russian military thinking, the Russians want a double buffer zone with an inner zone of control and an outer zone of denial, where American air bases, etc., will be knocked out, and probably as early as possible. In short, the DCA makes the Nordic countries a target in the very first phase of the war. To have a war in the north implies an attack on the very vital Kola bases and on the strategic submarines. For the same reason as the US wants to profit from this Russian vulnerability in a war, the Russians want to avoid it. They will avoid a war in Northern Europe and even more in the high north.
Ебать, это четвертая нахуй! Пятая, блядь! Тупо в завод Артема! Ебать, пиздую слышу!